Hi class. So this is the bones and the skeletal tissue lecture. I'm not gonna go through all of the slides, but I'm gonna go just through the major ones based on my bullets. So what is the major function of the bones? Support, protect, movement, mineral and growth factor storage, blood cell formation, triglycerides, hormone production. That's basically the overview. So the bone's responsibility, right, is kind of support, right? So we need this carcass, the structure for locomotion, so we're able to move our system. So the skeletal cartilage, made of highly resilient type of tissue. There's a lot of water within the cartilage, so it absorbs the pressure, shock absorption. So the cartilage contains no blood vessels or nerves, so it's avascular, and there are no nerves within the cartilage. And the tissue, the cartilage, and the bones and the other soft tissue that we discussed briefly, surrounded, wrapped around by a membrane, by a layer of another tissue. So the around. So just because we're talking about the cartilage, right? So the tissue that surrounds the cartilage is called perichondrium, cartilage, fibro, collagen, osseous, bone. So the periosteal membrane around the bone, perichondrial membrane around the cartilage. So perichondrium is just a layer of dense irregular tissue. You know that, irregular, so the fibers running in different directions, and that's for the cartilage. So this cartilage surrounded, wrapped around by that dense irregular tissue. That's a connective tissue surrounding the cartilage, like a girdle. So that tissue helps or resists the outward expansion, because you find this cartilage at the end of the long bones, and there's a pressure, especially when we go inferiorly, right? When we're going down. So there's more pressure applied on the bones. So whenever the cartilage is formed, and if you keep healthy, it would be healthy. But if there is a damage to the cartilage, fraction or injury, and that destroys the cartilage, then the cartilage is gone, so there's no rehabilitation. Then there should be surgical intervention. So here's the bone, right? Here's the bone, and that's the end of the bone. So the blood vessel stops here. So the blood vessels can bring nutrient up to this layer, but whatever happens in outermost layers, that's it. That's already formed cartilage, and there's no rehabilitation. So there's no formation of the new cartilage cells. So the cartilage is made of chondrocytes, right? Chondroblasts, blasts, are immature cells that are making new cartilage, and chondrocytes are mature cells. So the cartilage is a very important part of the bones. And the bones, besides the calcium and phosphorus, there are collagen fibers as well within the bone structures. We're going to look at that. There are three types of cartilages. We discussed this with the tissue lecture. So there's elastic cartilage, hyaline cartilage, and the fiber cartilage. And I put them in the order of their toughness. So the fiber cartilage is the most resilient one. So the elastic cartilage, as the name implied, that's very elastic, and you can find it right here within the ears and within the epiglottis. So the epiglottis is the flap that separates the trachea from the esophagus. So it makes sure when you're swallowing the food, so it protects the trachea. So it's basically the flap that covers the trachea, so the food bolus can slide in the correct hole in the esophagus. So it's made from the elastic cartilage, so it's the most flexible out of the three cartilages. Then the fibrocartilage is the toughest one, and the fibrocartilage found within the meniscus, within the knee joint, and the pubic symphysis, and between the vertebrae in intervertebral discs. So here's the vertebrate, here's the vertebrate, but in between the vertebrates you have this intervertebral disc. So it absorbs the shock. So, and that particular cartilage, fiber cartilage, has a greatest tensile strength, tension. And the most abundant cartilage is the hyaline cartilage. So it provides support, flexibility, and it's very resilient. So the tip of the nose, the end of the long bones, and within the costal ribs, right? So the costal cartilage. Thyroid cartilage, cricoid cartilage, the trachea, it's part of a, if I'm not mistaken, hyaline cartilage. So the classification of bones. So there are long bones, short bones, flat bones, and there are irregular bones. And we classify them by shape, right? So the long bones, as the name implies, here's the long bone. So the long bones are within your limbs, the upper limb and the lower limb, long bones. Short bones within the ankles, tarsals, and within the wrist, carpals. So the short bones, they kind of like a cube-shaped type of bones. Sesamoid, like within the patella, right? So also short bones. So the flat bones, your sternum, not just the sternum, the scapula, the shoulder blades, you cannot really see it here. The ribs also are the flat bones. Most of the skull bones within the cranium, like the 6 bones, the frontal to parietals, occipital bone, temporal bone, are the flat bone plates. And there are regular bones. They have complicated shape, so that's the vertebrate, right, bones, and the hip bones. So these are the irregular bones. So know them by classification. Bones are very complicated structures. So they have nervous tissue, they have cartilage, they have fibrous connective tissue, which is the collagen, muscles attached to the bone, and the like epithelial cells in its blood vessels. So the blood vessels are innervating bones. So the bones are highly innervated and highly vasculated, meaning there is a lot of blood vessels within the bones and there are a lot of nervous tissue within the bones. That's why it's very painful when there's a fracture of the skeletal tissue. So there's a further classification. So there's a compact and a spongy bones. So this arrangement pretty much falls under every bone, like an Oreo cookie. So this portion is a compact bone, and this portion is the spongy bone. And then there's a compact bone, like an Oreo cookie. So if you look here, like right here, you have a compact bone, then you have a spongy bone, and then you have a compact bone. So this is the femur of your thigh. So there's also a compact bone, thin, then there's a spongy bone, and on the opposite side there's a compact bone. So this represents one of the cranial bones, let's say parietal bones on the side, or temporal bone, or the frontal bone, or the occipital bone. So the outermost and the innermost, let's say brain is here, right, outermost layer made of compact bone, and inside is the spongy. Looks like a sponge. So there's another term for the spongy, and I would rather use that terminology, trabeculate. Like a triangle, right? So the structures. One of the toughest structure, if you look at the bridge structure, right, it's kind of triangle, right, because it supports from every angle. So that looks like it's a mesh, but that's a trabeculate. It kind of resembles the triangles. So trabeculate and the spongy is the same thing. So the compact bone dense outer layer on every bone that appears smooth and solid. Spongy bone or trabeculate bone made of honeycomb, small needle-like or flat pieces of bone that are called trabeculates. And there's some open spaces. So open spaces trabeculate are filled with red or yellow bone marrow. So here's the chunk of a bone. So this side, right, or this part, that's your compact bone. That's this part, right? That's this right here. So just for the visualization, so it would be easier for us to understand what the thing is. So they made it very thick, but in reality it's very thin, right? Compact bone. And then there's a spongy bone. So the sponge kind of continues up to here, but so here's a compact bone, and there's a lot of things going on within this very tiny structure. So there's a lot of images actually, so you can look from different directions when it comes to this. Like here's another image, right? So here's your compact bone outer layer, and here's a sponge inside, or here's a compact. So this represents a long bone. So because the long bone has a shaft inside, and within the shaft that's where the yellow marrow resides. But here's another view, right, of the compact bone. So I would be jumping between images because kind of each image has its own better visual representation. So let's come back to it. So the compact bone is made from the osteons. The osteon is the working unit of a bone. So you see, it's like an elevator shaft. It's like one osteon, another osteon, another osteon, and it looks like it's a trunk of the tree, like when you cut it horizontally. So, and within the osteon, you see like layers. So these layers are called lamellae. Here, lamellae, a layer, like a cake. So these lamellae within the osteon are concentric lamellae, circular lamellae. So that creates a toughness and strength for the bones. So one layer, another layer, like multiple layers. Like you see one lamellae, another lamellae, another lamellae. And each osteon, because the entire thing is the osteon, has its own central canal. And through the central canal, on this image, you only see blood vessels. So if you're gonna go to another image, this one on slide 24, here's a concentric lamellae. This is the entire thing is called osteon. Then each lamellae, just because it's circle, is concentric lamellae. And the central canal has blood vessels, arteries, veins. Yellow is the nervous tissue, and the green would be lymphatic tissue. So there's a different types of tissues within the bone. And also each osteon connected one to another with the nervous tissue, vascular tissue, lymphatic tissue, nervous tissue. So there's a constant communication between each osteon. And you see these little dark spaces right here? That's lacunas or lacunae. So the lamellae is a layer. Lacuna or lacunae is like a lake, and the active osteocytes cells resides there. They kind of trapped in these dark spaces. There's another image that actually represents this. And there's a perforating canals. Here's a cross section, and you can see like one osteon, and here's another osteon, and there's a communication. So this osteon communicates with this osteon. So whatever is going on here, this osteon will know what is going on in another one. So there's constant communication. So, and to go from this osteon to this osteon, you have to go through a perforating canal right here. It perforates. So this is our perforating canal. Another name for a central canal right here. So the central canal, you can see it better here. Central canal is Haversian canal. Each bone, the entire bone, wrapped around by the membrane, periosteal membrane, around. So here's the membrane, outer layer, periosteal membrane. Like pericondyal membrane around the cartilage, here's the periosteal membrane. Periosteal membrane, osteons made of lamellae, layers, central canal or the Haversian canal, and perforating canals going from one osteon to another osteon. So in each osteon with its lamellae, it's concentric lamellae. But there is also lamellae layers on the outermost part of the compact bone called circumferential lamellae, also represents a circular division. And each lamellae has a collagen fibers, and you see collagen fibers running in different direction. One lamellae collagen fibers one direction, another lamellae collagen fibers another direction, and another lamellae another direction. So that's for concentric forces. So this would be concentric force, this stretching would be tensile force, and the compression force would be the force that that applied right here. So there would be compression force, on top stretching would be tensile force, and when you're stretching in a different direction, it would be concentric force. For example, when you have the baseball and you throw the baseball, so you have to rotate along the axis of your levers. So the bones are very resilient, so you can see how complicated they are. So let's look at this image now. This is by far, there's another image, right? Again, this blue represents periosteal membrane, and just because you see blood vessels and the nervous tissues within the bone, periosteal membrane is also, you see the blood vessels and the nervous tissue is also highly innervated and vasculated. And that's how the blood vessels and the vascular tissue getting inside of the bone, so it enters through the foramen. Foramen is a hole. So there are holes in the bones and the holes in the tissues, so we can enter inside. Please remember this term, foramen. We're gonna discuss this later. Here, within the compact bone, you can see the lamellae, the layers, central canal, and these lacunas, right? Lacunae or lacuna, this yellow stuff. That's where the cells, the mature cells, are trapped, osteocytes. So the osteoblasts are immature cells, so they are making bone cells. And then they become osteocytes. And the osteocytes will be trapped within the lacunas because they cannot go anywhere, because when they secrete this matrix, they are trapped. They cannot go anywhere, but they can communicate with the neighboring cell. So you see, here's one osteocyte, and there's a little dot there, so let me make this bigger. You see this a nucleus, and here's the cell. So this cell, this is trapped in its own lacuna, can communicate with the neighboring cell, because you see these little lines, these are the canaliculi. So one osteocyte can communicate with another osteocyte through the canaliculi, through these canals. So as you see, it's like a networking, and it's a highly vasculated and innervated tissue. So now we can look at the structure of the bone, also important for the lab and for the lecture. So here's the bone, here's the spongy red marrow. So the red marrow usually within the spongy region, at the end of the long bones. This is the end of the long bone, this is the end of the long bone. So the red bone marrow is producing red blood cells, and the white blood cells are also produced in there. Within the shaft, here's the yellow bone marrow. Fat, we need it. Energy as well. So the important terminology within the bones. The ends of the bones are called epiphyses. Epi, on top. This is the proximal, this is the distal part of the bone. So this is the epiphysis and this is the epiphysis. This is diaphysis. And when the bone grows, it elongates, right? It elongates from the middle, from the diaphysis. So it elongation of the bone. So the bone stretches, and that's how the person gets its height within the long bones, right? Within the upper limbs and the lower limbs. So there's also another term, it's called appositional growth. It means that the deposition of new cells are done in this layer, and there's a removal of the cells are done within this layer, so the bones become thicker. So they would not be very thick and heavy, so that's why we're depositing new cells on the outer layer and we're removing cells in the inner layer. So it's basically, if we would be depositing in both layers, so the compact bone would be very thick. So we're removing bone here and we're depositing bone here, and we're keeping the same thickness, but they become wider, wider, and wider, slightly. and the bones are elongate as well. So, but elongation controlled by the hormones, obviously, but there's a thing called epiphyseal plate. It says line here, but let's call it plate for now. Epiphyseal, epiphysis at the end of the long bones, epiphyseal plate right here, and epiphyseal plate right here. Epiphyseal plate, plate, epiphyseal plate, and plate. It's called line. I will explain it later. And here you can see this epiphyseal plate. The reason it's called line here because that's the line. That's what you can see under the X-ray, and it's solid. Epiphyseal plate, you cannot really see it. It's kind of murky. So what is that? So epiphyseal plate, when we call it plate, it means that it's a cartilage. Epiphyseal line, it is already calcified cartilage. The cartilage can turn into bone. So it's a growth plate. Growth plate. It permits the bones elongate. It permits the deposition of the new tissue so the bones can elongate. So when that cartilage turns into a bone, calcified or ossified, then the elongation of bones stops and the person stops growing in height. With males, it usually happens within the 18 years of age, with females 16 years of age. So it's called epiphyseal plate while it is a cartilage, and when the genes kick in and they say, all right, let's calcify that, and the plate turns into a line because now you can see it definitely under the X-ray and it's already bone. So you see this tissue looks exactly the same as this tissue. So here's the yellow bone marrow. Here's the osteons with the central canals, with Haversian canal. Here's the blood vessels entering inside of the bone. And it passes through the periosteal membrane, passes through the foramen, periosteal foramen. And each bone surrounded by this tissue. Similar kind of tissues inside of the bone in inner layer as well, but so this is the periosteum, and inside of the bone would be endosteal membrane, inside and outside. And now we're gonna discuss osteogenic, generation, production, new. So every time you hear genesis as a suffix at the end of the word, it means it's making something new, generation. Here's another slide that talks about the terminology. So what's important here? I would say everything important, but foramen, hole that allows vessels and nerves to get inside. Here's the foramen, here's the foramen. So the foramen, the hole that permits tissue to get inside of the bone. Sinuses is just a cavity in a hollow spaces, like orbitals, right? Sinuses. Nasal sinuses, openings, hollow organs. Fossa, depression in the tissue. Like here, this would be fossa, right? Depression. Fissure, it's a crack, elongated crack in the bone. Fissure. Spine, sharp angle, right? So the crest and the spine. So the spine would be like this, like here would be the spine. And the crest would be this, like a ridge, outermost layer of the bone, like right here, crest. Condyle, very round, smooth surface, right? It's like this, condyles at the end of the long bones. Head, like this is the head. Kind of similar to condyle, but condyle is small, smooth surface. Head is also surface, smooth, but it's like a doorknob. Osteogenic cells. So there's an osteoprogenitor cell, stem cells, that gives the rise to other cells to this family, right? And here this cell belongs to other family, but it's crazy important. So let's concentrate on these three cells. 1, 2, 3. So the osteoblasts are matrix synthesizing cells, right? Producing cells, like blasting, osteoblasts. So the osteoblast is immature, responsible for the bone growth, and then will become a mature cell that is called osteocyte. And the osteocyte would be trapped in the lacunas. And then through these dendrites, it will communicate through the canaliculi to the neighboring cell, right? To a neighboring osteocyte that trapped within the lacuna. Remember that. And then from another family, from the white blood lineage, cell, osteoclast. To make it simple, osteoblasts are making bone, and osteoclasts are removing bone or breaking down bone. Osteoblast laying down new bone, and osteoclast removing bone. The entire process, that making and removing, is called bone remodeling. You remodel tissue. So our body constantly laying down new bone and constantly removing bone. So it's called bone remodeling. If there's a fracture, so the broken bone needs to be removed. So the osteoclast will remove the old bone, and the osteoblast will lay down the new bone. So also we can refer to the osteoclasts are the bone resorbing cells. So the resorption, taking out. So bone remodeling. Osteoclasts remove and osteoblasts laying down. Here's a little bit more information on each cell. So the osteocytes, they communicate information to osteoblasts and osteoclasts. Okay, so there's a damage around me, remove, osteoclast will remove. Oh, you need to lay down new bone, so the osteoblast will be laying down new bone. So the entire process is called remodeling, and it constantly happens non-stop. So osteogenesis is making new bone, so it's a bone tissue formation. So the formation of the bony skeleton begins in the months of 2 of the development. So there's a postnatal bone growth, occurs until the early adulthood. So the bone remodeling and repair are the lifelong. So there's a new cartilage grows at the epiphyseal plates, and ossification replaces the cartilage within the bone. So when all cartilages is ossified, bones, they do stop growing, and the epiphyseal plate becomes an epiphyseal line. So it's basically the overview of the entire process. So the formation of the bony skeleton before the birth, up to about week 8, fibrous membranes are made of hyaline cartilage of the fetal skeleton, right? The fetus. So first it's an embryo, and then it's a fetus. In gestation, in the first trimester, the embryo turns into the fetus about 8 weeks, about 2 months. So then up to about 8 weeks, 2 months. So those fibrous membranes and the hyaline cartilage of the fetal skeleton, so they would be replaced by the bone tissue. So there's 2 types of ossification. One is called endochondral ossification, and another called is intramembranous ossification. So endochondral ossification, so the bond are formed by replacing the hyaline cartilage. So it's a collagen cartilage under the bone, and the bones are called cartilage or endochondral bones. So they mostly made of the cartilage, and then the ossification happens. It's like first you're laying down a form to make sure that, okay, so that bone looks great, let me convert this bone, this tissue into the actual bone. When we say bone, we kind of assume that it's already calcified. So you're laying down the form, there's made out of the cartilage, it's like, okay, so now we can calcify this, looks great. And there is intramembranous ossification. So the bone develops from fibrous membrane, fiber, collagen. Bones are called membrane bones. Forms frontal, parietal, occipital, temporal, and clavicle. Frontal, parietal, occipital, temporal, and the clavicular bones, clavicle bones. So that's intramembranous ossification. It's not the complete list, so there's more. So I do recommend to go through the rest of the lecture, but that's pretty much what you need to know for the bone tissue. Have a good day.